February 1943, Northwest Territories, Canada. Latitude 62 degree on. The landscape speaks only in silence and ice. The thermometer reads -47 degrees Celsius. Frost crystals hang suspended in the air like microscopic daggers, refracting what little sunlight penetrates the Arctic morning. The sky itself appears bruised, a palette of gray and white that stretches infinitely in every direction, interrupted only by the jagged outline of distant mountains, their peaks swallowed by cloud cover. The location has no official name, not yet, not in any government file, not in any War Department memo. The maps that existed in Ottawa, Washington, and even in the underground bunkers of Whitehall simply marked it as a void, a blank space of no strategic value, a frozen wasteland, an irrelevance, but someone knew better. A figure emerges from the white. Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison, Canadian Army Engineers attached to the Special Projects Directorate, 38 years old, career soldier. His uniform carries the insignia of someone accustomed to classified assignments. Behind him, two enlisted men struggle against the wind, their faces wrapped in wool, their eyes watering from the Arctic cold. They carry surveying equipment, theodolites, measuring chains, weatherproofed notebooks. Harrison's breath emerges in violent clouds. He does not stop. He does not acknowledge the cold. This is not his first Arctic deployment, but every deployment teaches him the same lesson. The North Atlantic and Arctic regions respect no man's comfort. They acknowledge only necessity. The party moves across the frozen surface of what appears to be a desolate northern lake. Its name is rarely spoken. Lake Athabasca Extension. Though cartographers have indexed dozens of similar formations across this region, the ice beneath their feet is 6 feet thick, solid enough to support the weight of a truck, solid enough to carry secrets. This is precision. This is planning. An untrained eye would see only frozen water and white emptiness. But Harrison's eyes search for markers that no casual observer would recognize. A subtle discoloration in the ice, a faint trace where wind patterns break differently. The trained military eye recognizes what civilians cannot, the geometry of concealment. By February 1943, the global war had reached a critical inflection point. Nazi Germany controlled continental Europe from the Atlantic coast to the gates of Moscow. Japan held dominion across the Pacific, from Manchuria to the Solomon Islands. The Soviet Union bled on every front. Stalingrad had fallen just 1 month prior, and Moscow itself seemed perpetually under threat. In North Africa, Rommel's Africa Corps had pushed British forces backward, threatening the Suez Canal. The Atlantic remained contested waters where German U-boats sank Allied shipping faster than factories could replace it. For Canada, the situation demanded impossible choices. The nation's industrial capacity was already strained to breaking point. Aircraft production at Canadian factories, de Havilland, Avro, Canadair, could not keep pace with losses. British pilots needed replacements. American aircraft needed delivery routes that bypassed the U-boat-infested Atlantic waters. The conventional solutions had failed. Military planners in Ottawa had been studying Arctic maps for months. Northern Canada remained largely unexplored, unmapped in any comprehensive military sense. The indigenous populations knew these lands intimately, but the Canadian Army had only fragmented intelligence about infrastructure, weather patterns, and supply logistics. Beyond the Arctic Circle, there were few roads. No railways led north. The terrain changed seasonally. Ice became water, water became mud, and then winter returned to freeze everything solid again. It was the perfect location for something that could not exist, something that, if discovered, would change the strategic balance of the entire war. The structure is intentionally primitive. It appears abandoned. Its timber is gray with age, or appearing so, artificially aged. The single door bears no markings. No antenna protrudes from its roof. No smoke emerges from any chimney. To any aerial reconnaissance, including German reconnaissance photographs, this structure registered as a derelict hunting lodge, a remnant from some failed northern settlement. This assessment was precisely what the planners in Ottawa intended. Harrison enters. The enlisted men remain outside, maintaining perimeter watch despite the brutal cold. Inside, the structure maintains a temperature just above freezing, barely habitable, carefully monitored. 3 men in civilian clothes turn toward the entrance. They are engineers, not military. They represent 3 different firms, one Canadian, one British, one American. This itself constitutes a violation of military protocol. Inter-allied collaborative projects of this scale required explicit authorization from the highest levels of government. The authorization existed. It was simply not documented anywhere that could be found. On a wooden table lies a blueprint. The dimensions are unusual. The specifications are meticulous. The scale drawings indicate something vast, far too vast for the modest structure that conceals the planning room. The blueprint shows cross-sections, depth measurements, ventilation systems, power distribution specifications, and something labeled only as S-level capacity, 850 personnel plus equipment. Harrison studies the blueprint without touching it. He has memorized the key specifications already. 850 personnel, underground, beneath a frozen lake in Canadian territory that no enemy believed possessed strategic value. A base so secret that even the Canadian Parliament would not be fully informed of its existence. The goal was simple, though its execution was theoretically impossible. Create a self-contained military facility capable of housing, feeding, and deploying strategic assets, all while remaining completely invisible to enemy reconnaissance. An underground fortress not in Europe, not on a coastline where conventional fortifications might be expected, but in the Arctic, where survival itself constituted the primary enemy. This was not a defensive installation. Defensive installations announce themselves. They bristle with anti-aircraft guns and radar. They sit in predictable locations. This was something far different. This was a staging facility, a place to gather resources for an operation that the Allies barely believed possible themselves. What no German intelligence officer suspected, what Tokyo's military attachés could not imagine, was that beneath this ice lay the beginning of something that would fundamentally transform aerial warfare over the North Atlantic. The Nazis controlled the skies of Europe. They believed the Atlantic itself was their domain, but Canada was about to prove them catastrophically wrong. The secret was about to be excavated. The impossible was about to become operational. The descent begins at 600 hours. Harrison moves through a tunnel carved directly into bedrock beneath the frozen lake. The walls are reinforced concrete, poured in sections during the previous summer when the frozen surface provided temporary access. Electric lights, shielded, minimal, illuminate the passage at intervals. The temperature gradually rises from the Arctic surface cold to a maintained 48 degrees Fahrenheit. The air smells of diesel fuel, wet concrete, and machine oil. The tunnel extends 1-2 kilometers beneath the ice. This alone was an engineering feat of extraordinary complexity. Traditional excavation methods would have generated noise, debris, and debris trails visible from aerial reconnaissance. The Canadians and their American and British counterparts had devised a solution: seasonal drilling. During the brief Arctic summer months when surface temperatures rose above freezing and the ice retreated from the shoreline, teams worked in 6-hour rotating shifts. They drilled downward, then horizontally, using pneumatic equipment powered by diesel generators positioned 2 kilometers away. The sound dispersed across the Arctic landscape, where no civilian population existed to report it. The main cavern appears first. This is not a natural cavern. Every inch bears the marks of deliberate excavation. The walls have been stabilized with reinforced concrete panels bolted into place. Ventilation shafts, multiple redundant systems, penetrate the upper ceiling. The flooring consists of reinforced concrete poured in sections. Electric lines run in conduits along the walls, carrying power from generators stationed in a separate cavern system. Water pipes follow similar routes, terminating at collection and purification systems. The cavern itself has been subdivided into distinct sections by temporary walls constructed from wood and canvas. Each section serves a specific function: ammunition storage, fuel depot, supplies warehouse, personnel barracks, communication center, medical facility, and maintenance hangar. But it is the hangar section that demands attention. By the spring of 1943, the operation had acquired a name: Project Ark. It remained classified at the highest level, known to Churchill, Roosevelt, and King in Canada, but compartmentalized so thoroughly that even senior military commanders in Ottawa possessed only fragmentary knowledge of its scope. The objective was audacious to the point of strategic delusion: establish a permanent ferry route for military aircraft directly across the Arctic to the Soviet Union. To understand why this seemed impossible requires understanding the geography of logistics in 1943. The standard transatlantic ferry route followed what pilots called the Northern Route, departing from aircraft factories in Canada or the United States, flying east across the Atlantic to Labrador, then to Greenland, then to Iceland, then to the United Kingdom. From there, additional ferry flights continued to Soviet territories. The entire operation required approximately 15 separate airfields across 4 nations. Each airfield required maintenance personnel, fuel supplies, spare parts, and anti-aircraft defenses. More critically, every segment of this route was vulnerable to German U-boats, Luftwaffe fighters, or long-range reconnaissance aircraft. The alternative was the Arctic route, direct, northern, over terrain where no German presence existed. This was also the reason no one had attempted it before. The Arctic route was theoretically impossible. Aircraft in 1943 had limited range. The Lend-Lease aircraft being delivered to the Soviet Union, Bell P-39 Airacobras, Douglas A-20 Havocs, Curtiss P-40 Warhawks, were single-engine fighters or light bombers. Their fuel capacity permitted range of approximately 1,500 kilometers under ideal conditions. The Arctic route required covering approximately 3,500 kilometers across ice, ocean, and tundra, twice the aircraft's operational range, unless the aircraft refueled, unless there existed a hidden airfield, positioned at the absolute midpoint of the Arctic Ocean, where planes could land, refuel, and continue their journey. This was Project Arc, not one hidden airfield, but a cascade of them, each positioned along a great circle route that crossed the Arctic at the shortest possible distance. The lake facility near Harrison's position was designated as Station 4. 3 other similar facilities existed or were under construction at different Arctic locations. Each could accommodate military transport aircraft and fighter planes. Each maintained fuel depots, landing strips carved from ice, and underground infrastructure designed to remain invisible to aerial reconnaissance. 4 P-39 Airacobras sit with their engines partially disassembled. Fuel system modifications are underway. The Soviet aircraft require specialized adaptations for Arctic operations. Fuel heated to prevent freezing at high altitude, engines winterized beyond standard specification, landing gear reinforced to handle ice surface operations. More significantly, the aircraft are being equipped with external ferry tanks, massive fuel containers that would extend their operational range to precisely the distance required to transit from one hidden base to the next. A military logistics officer, Major Robert Chen from the U.S. Army Air Forces, stands before a detailed flight map pinned to the wooden wall. The map shows a series of geographic coordinates marked with red X symbols. Each X represents a proposed or operational ferry staging point. The route traces across northern Canada, over the Arctic Ocean, across Greenland, Iceland, Bear Island, and then into Soviet territory. The distances marked alongside each leg are precise. Station 1, Yellowknife, Northwest Territories to Station 2, Resolute Bay, Arctic Archipelago, 1,680 kilometers. Station 2 to Station 3, Grise Fjord, Ellesmere Island, 1,420 kilometers. Station 3 to Station 4, the Lake Facility, 1,550 kilometers. Station 4 to Station 5, Svalbard, Norway, covert Norwegian operations, 1,290 kilometers. Station 5 to Soviet Landing Zone, Northern Siberia, 1,840 kilometers. The mathematics were brutal. A single P-39 with standard fuel capacity could not reach any of these distances, but equipped with external tanks and routed through the staging points, a ferry pilot possessed just enough fuel margin to complete each leg with minimal safety reserve. The operation required precision, exact departure times, weather windows, fuel consumption calculations accurate to the liter. Failure meant the pilot ditched in Arctic ice. Rescue was theoretically possible but practically unlikely. The terrain permitted no emergency landing alternatives. The ocean temperatures would render survival possible for approximately 12 minutes. This was understood. Pilots volunteered anyway. The handwritten entries document each successful ferry transit: dates, aircraft types, pilot names, fuel consumption data, and delivery confirmations. By February 1943, the log recorded 83 successful deliveries. By June 1943, the number had climbed to 347. By December 1943, Project Arc had delivered 1,147 aircraft to Soviet forces. These were not cargo planes loaded with supplies. These were combat aircraft, P-39s, A-20s, P-40s, fighters and light bombers capable of engaging German Luftwaffe aircraft and providing tactical air support to ground forces. The Germans knew Soviet air strength was increasing. Their intelligence analyst reported growing Soviet aircraft production. But German planners could not comprehend the arithmetic. The Soviet factories were producing planes at levels that seemed impossible given available industrial capacity. No German intelligence officer suspected that American aircraft, built in Detroit and Wichita, were being ferried across the Arctic by a route so secret that even the Canadian Parliament remained uninformed of its specifics. The aircraft ascends through a constructed shaft and emerges onto the frozen lake surface at precisely 07:30 hours. The ice landing strip has been marked by invisible markers, subtle depressions in the snow that only trained pilot eyes recognize. The runway extends 2 kilometers across the frozen lake surface, capable of supporting aircraft weight up to 5 tons. The P-39's pilot, Captain Frank Whitmore from Seattle, has completed this route 6 times. He knows the fuel calculations. He knows the weather patterns. He knows the single-engine reliability margins that permit no mechanical failure. His radio transmission is encrypted using a cipher that changes daily. It contains only essential information: aircraft type, fuel status, weather conditions at the next station, and estimated time of arrival. No position data, no destination coordinates, nothing that could compromise the operation if intercepted. The aircraft rotates into position. The engines spool to full power. The ice surface trembles slightly beneath the landing gear. In Berlin, in Tokyo, and Vichy, France, every Axis intelligence service monitored radio transmissions across the Arctic. They detected these encrypted signals. The frequency patterns made clear that something operational was occurring in the Canadian North, but the route made no strategic sense to their analysts. No military target existed in those frozen wastes. The signals themselves were too brief to provide triangulation data. What Axis intelligence could not comprehend was the audacity of the operation itself, a permanent supply line, completely invisible, that was reshaping the entire strategic balance on the Eastern Front. The P-39 lifts off from the ice. October 1943. The Reich Air Ministry occupies a sprawling complex in central Berlin, its corridors lined with oak paneling and portraits of Nazi leadership. But in the basement, in the Signals Intelligence Division, officers bend over wooden tables covered in maps, radio direction finding charts, and encrypted signal logs. Oberfuhrer Klaus Richter, head of Luftwaffe intelligence operations, studies a classified briefing document dated October 14, 1943. The title page is stamped Geheime Reichssache, State Secret of the Highest Classification. The subject matter is troubling. For months, German signals intelligence had been intercepting encrypted radio transmissions originating from the Canadian Arctic. The frequency patterns were consistent. The signal timing was regular. The encryption protocols changed daily, indicating military-grade security, but the geographic origin points made no operational sense. The signals emanated from coordinates north of 62 degrees latitude, terrain so desolate, so devoid of strategic value, that no rational military operation could justify establishing a permanent communication center there. The Wehrmacht possessed detailed maps of North American geography. The specialists at the Oberkommando knew that no significant Allied military installation existed in those regions. Yet the signals continued. German direction-finding equipment, operating from listening stations in occupied Norway and from covert installations in Greenland, had triangulated the signal sources. The analysis pointed toward discrete geographic locations in the Canadian North. The triangulation was imprecise. Arctic atmospheric conditions distorted radio propagation, but the general pattern was undeniable. Something was transmitting from the Canadian Arctic, something with regular operational schedules, something protected by military-grade encryption. Richter's assessment was direct. Purpose unknown. Strategic significance undetermined. Recommend continued monitoring and analysis. This was the most honest assessment possible. The Germans could detect the signals. They could not intercept the content. They could not determine the operational purpose. And most critically, they could not determine whether this represented a genuine strategic threat or merely a communications relay station of minimal importance. July 1943. 247 aircraft lost in combat operations. August 1943. 289 aircraft lost. September 1943. 312 aircraft lost. October 1943. 356 aircraft lost. The trend was unambiguous. German air losses were accelerating. More significantly, the nature of the losses had changed. Earlier in the war, German pilots reported engagements with Soviet aircraft that were clearly inferior. Older designs, less reliable engines, inadequately trained pilots. By October 1943, German pilots were reporting encounters with Soviet fighter aircraft that were modern, well-maintained and flown by experienced combat pilots. The Luftwaffe's operational planning staff could account for Soviet aircraft production from known Soviet factories. The production numbers matched German intelligence estimates, but the actual Soviet air strength in operational squadrons exceeded the production estimates by approximately 40%. This discrepancy was unexplained. General Adolf Galland, Inspector General of the Luftwaffe, addresses the assembled staff. His voice carries frustration barely contained within military protocol. The Soviet air strength has increased beyond our production models. We do not know the source. We do not know the delivery mechanism. Our intelligence analysts suggest three possibilities: hidden Soviet production capacity in the Urals, undetected aircraft transfers from British sources, or American Lend-Lease aircraft delivered through unknown routes. A junior officer ventures an analysis. Herr General, the American aircraft deliveries to the Soviet Union have been documented through only three known routes: the Persian corridor through Iran and Iraq, the Vladivostok route across the Pacific, and limited quantities through Arkhangelsk. All three routes are monitored. The volume of American aircraft reaching Soviet forces does not exceed our estimates. Galland's response is terse. Then our estimates are incorrect. The facts on the front lines contradict our assessments. This was the strategic predicament facing Nazi Germany by mid-1943. The Eastern Front was deteriorating. The massive German offensive at Kursk had failed in August. The Soviets were advancing. German forces were retreating. The mathematical reality was becoming impossible to deny. Germany was losing the initiative on the Eastern Front, and the Luftwaffe could not explain why Soviet air strength was growing faster than German intelligence models predicted. In Tokyo, the Japanese intelligence service faced a parallel mystery. American naval aircraft, specifically the Brewster F-2A Buffalo and the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, were appearing in increasing numbers across the Pacific. Some of these aircraft bore Soviet markings. They were being deployed from Alaskan bases and from hidden airfields in the Aleutian Islands. The Japanese intelligence staff could not determine why the Americans would deliver aircraft to Soviet forces operating in the Pacific when the Soviet Union was not actively engaged against Japan. The logical explanation suggested American-Soviet military coordination that Japanese strategists had assumed was minimal. This was categorically impossible, or so Japanese planners believed. From Soviet archives, documents that would remain classified until decades after the war, the reality becomes evident. Between January 1943 and December 1943, the Soviet Air Force received 1,847 aircraft through Project Ark. These deliveries occurred entirely through the Arctic route. Not a single aircraft in this shipment was documented in German or Japanese intelligence reports analyzing Lend-Lease deliveries. The P-39 Airacobra, despite its limitations in European air combat, proved effective in Soviet hands for ground support operations. The A-20 Havoc provided light bombing capability. The P-40 Warhawk offered reliable fighter aircraft for defensive operations. Collectively, these aircraft shifted Soviet air strength in three critical sectors of the Eastern Front by approximately 15 to 20%, a swing in air superiority that translated directly into tactical and operational advantages on the ground. The connection between Project Ark and the deteriorating German position on the Eastern Front was real, but unmeasurable through intelligence analysis alone. The Germans could observe the effect, increasing Soviet air strength, but they could not trace the cause. Their reconnaissance aircraft had not detected the Arctic route because the aircraft were flying at precisely the moment and altitude where German reconnaissance operations faced maximum atmospheric interference and minimum visibility. The Luftwaffe's high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft, specifically the Junkers Ju-86P, operated at altitudes exceeding 13,000 meters, where the thin air limited German photographic resolution. The Arctic ferry flights occurred at altitudes between 3,000 and 5,000 meters, deliberately positioned below the reconnaissance ceiling, where atmospheric conditions provided natural concealment. The German reconnaissance pattern operated on predictable schedules. Project Ark pilots, equipped with current intelligence about German reconnaissance operations, deliberately scheduled ferry flights during the 72-hour periods when German reconnaissance aircraft were conducting operations elsewhere, over the Soviet Union itself, over British airspace over the Atlantic. By late 1943, the Oberkommando der Luftwaffe had come to an inescapable conclusion, documented in secret staff assessments. The Allies possessed an aircraft delivery capability that exceeded German intelligence estimates by a factor of at least 1.5. The source of this capability remained unknown. The delivery mechanism remained undetected. The geographic origin remained mysterious. The assessment reads, "The enemy possesses supply capabilities superior to previous estimates." The nature of these capabilities suggests organized logistic operations conducted in geographic regions previously assessed as possessing minimal strategic value. Continued investigation recommended. Recommended defensive countermeasures. Increase reconnaissance operations in Arctic regions. Increase Luftwaffe patrols in northern Atlantic approaches. Initiate U-boat operations in Arctic waters. The Germans would never learn the truth. Project Ark would remain secret throughout the war and for decades afterward. But the operational reality was undeniable. The invisible Arctic route had shifted the balance of air power on the Eastern Front. Every P-39 that engaged German bombers over Stalingrad traced its delivery back to the frozen lake hidden beneath Canadian Arctic ice. Every A-20 that supported Soviet ground forces on the advance toward Berlin carried within its logistic history the fingerprints of Allied cooperation so complete it had to remain invisible. The Luftwaffe could detect symptoms but not diagnose the disease. By the time German strategic planners even began to suspect that an Arctic supply line might exist, the Soviet Air Force had already accumulated sufficient aircraft and trained sufficient pilots to contest German air superiority permanently. The war on the Eastern Front had been shifted by a route no Axis power could detect or counter. Ulyusat, the underground hangar, operates at maximum capacity. 16 hours per day, aircraft cycle through maintenance stations, fueling operations, and pilot briefings. The cavern echoes with the sound of diesel engines, pneumatic tools, and radio communications conducted in whispered military protocol. The operation has evolved. What began as an experimental program in early 1943 has transformed into an industrial-scale logistics pipeline. The initial skepticism, the operational assessments that deemed Project Ark theoretically impossible, has been replaced by systematic industrial execution. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, now promoted and assigned permanent command of the Arctic region supply operations, stands before an updated operations log that stretches across 4 leather-bound volumes. By August 1944, Project Ark had achieved a milestone that would remain classified for 30 years. The successful delivery of over 6,400 military aircraft across the Arctic route to Soviet forces. The numbers seem abstract when stated in isolation, but translated into operational consequence, the arithmetic became devastatingly concrete. Each aircraft represented a pilot. Each pilot represented a tactical capability. Each tactical capability represented a position on the front line that could be held or contested. The Soviet Air Force, equipped with American and British aircraft delivered through Project Ark, had seized and maintained air superiority across the Eastern Front. German pilots reported increasingly that they encountered superior aircraft, not in individual capability necessarily, but in overwhelming numbers, deployed with precision, flown by veteran pilots who had accumulated combat experience while flying American-built airframes. The correlation was not coincidental. German military planners analyzing the Soviet counteroffensive operations beginning in late 1943 and accelerating through 1944 could identify the turning point with precision, the moment when Soviet air strength exceeded German air strength permanently, the moment when Soviet ground forces could operate with overhead fighter cover, the moment when German Luftwaffe aircraft could no longer guarantee local air superiority. That moment traced directly back to Project Ark. The Stalingrad offensive, which began in November 1943, succeeded partially because Soviet air forces provided sustained close air support to ground troops, support that became possible only after sufficient numbers of American aircraft had been delivered and integrated into Soviet operational doctrine. The Kursk counteroffensive in late 1943, which finally broke German momentum and established Soviet strategic initiative, succeeded because Soviet air forces contested German air support. The massive Soviet winter offensive of 1943-44, which drove German forces back beyond the Dnieper River, succeeded because Soviet air forces provided continuous reconnaissance and tactical bombing support. The Bagration operation in summer 1944, which crushed German Army Group Center and liberated Belarus, succeeded because Soviet air forces achieved overwhelming local air superiority, an achievement directly enabled by the continuous delivery of aircraft through the Arctic route. By August 1944, the runway had been enlarged and reinforced. The ice support infrastructure developed through 3 seasons of operational experience permitted heavier aircraft, including Douglas C-47 transport aircraft, to operate from the facility. The hangar cavern had been expanded. Additional chambers had been excavated to house ammunition depots, spare parts warehouses, and expanded fuel storage facilities. The personnel complement had grown to 847 military personnel and 143 civilian engineers and support staff. The operation had achieved a permanence previously thought impossible. In Berlin, by August 1944, the reality had finally become inescapable. German intelligence analysts, cross-referencing interrogation reports from captured Soviet pilots, signals intelligence from intercepted communications, and strategic assessment of the Eastern Front situation, had concluded that an undiscovered supply line was delivering American aircraft to Soviet forces in quantity and consistency that exceeded any previously documented method. A classified memo from the German General Staff dated August 18, 1944, proposed the hypothesis: the enemy appears to possess an Arctic delivery route of significant capacity. The exact location and operational details remain unknown. Recommended countermeasures include increased U-boat operations in Arctic waters, initiation of long-range reconnaissance over northern Canada, and development of strategic bombing plans against suspected American aircraft production facilities. The recommendations came too late. The strategic initiative had shifted beyond retrieval. The photograph was taken by Soviet war correspondents and filed in Soviet military archives. It was not classified. It was not secret. It was simply documentation of standard operational conditions. The P-39 era Cobra, by late 1944, was considered standard equipment in Soviet fighter squadrons. Pilots trained on it as a matter of routine. Mechanics maintained it as a commonplace aircraft. The extraordinary had become ordinary. The final accounting of Project Ark came only after the war ended. Between January 1943 and May 1945, the operation delivered 7,164 military aircraft across the Arctic route to Soviet forces. The total included 3 Tu-47 P-39 era Cobra fighters, 2,141 A-20 Havoc light bombers, 1,804 P-40 Warhawk fighters, 642 miscellaneous transport and utility aircraft. The operation sustained a loss rate of 1%. 86 aircraft and crews lost to weather, mechanical failure, navigational error, and the inherent dangers of Arctic operations. By contemporary standards, this loss rate was considered acceptable. The personnel casualty rate was 0.8%, approximately 68 personnel killed in Arctic operations. This figure was extraordinarily low for a military operation of this scale and duration. The financial cost was estimated at $847 million, a sum equivalent to approximately $14 billion in 2024 currency values. The strategic return was incommensurable in financial terms. By May 1945, when Nazi Germany surrendered unconditionally, the role of Project Ark in the Soviet victory had become unmistakable. Soviet military historians, working within the constraints of Cold War classification protocols, quietly acknowledged that American aircraft had provided essential tactical capabilities that accelerated the Soviet advance into Germany. German military assessments, captured after the war, documented that Luftwaffe commanders had never discovered the Arctic supply route. They suspected its existence but could not locate it, could not attack it, could not disrupt it. The war in Europe was decided, at least partially, by a route that remained invisible to one side until the war itself had ended. Project Ark was deactivated in September 1945. The installations were dismantled. The personnel were reassigned. The documents were classified at the highest level. The operation became one of the war's best-kept secrets, a secret so complete that even 50 years after the war's conclusion, historians barely mentioned it. The lake returned to silence. The ice froze again. The Arctic consumed the evidence of human intervention. By 1960, if an observer had stood on the frozen surface, no trace of the facility would have been visible. But the impact remained written in the historical record in ways that most observers never recognized. The Soviet victory on the Eastern Front was not inevitable. It was achieved through superior strategy, superior numbers, and superior willpower. But it was also achieved through American industrial capacity delivered through a route so secret that even the Germans could not detect it. The secret beneath the frozen lake changed the course of the Second World War. It delivered not just aircraft, it delivered the margin of victory, a margin that the Nazis never knew existed. an operation so complete in its secrecy that it remained hidden even from its enemy until decades after the war had ended. This is how wars are truly won, not through the operations that make headlines, but through the operations that must remain invisible. Thank you for watching. If this forgotten story amazed you, subscribe for more untold chapters of World War II. Which secret operation do you think changed the war the most? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want more documentaries on classified military history, click the bell icon to stay updated. History is filled with stories like this, stories that shaped our world, but remained hidden in plain sight.